The exhibition's called Beyond the Border, New Contemporary Photography from Scotland, and it's the first major contemporary photography show shown outside of Scotland in a generation. So we're playing on this notion of we're taking work from outside of Scotland and contemporary photographers and bringing it across the border from Scotland into England. So there's that kind of physical notion. Also on an intellectual notion, we're playing with that notion of borders. What does it mean to be Scottish? What does it mean to be British? If Scotland becomes an independent nation, will there be a border? Will there be a new identity? So we try to encapsulate all that in a simple title.
I call my work The Edge of an Empire because it was a project about the Antonine Wall in Scotland, which was built in AD 140 by Emperor Antoninus Pius of the Roman Empire. First they had built the Hadrian's Wall in the north of England, and then they had advanced and built the Antonine Wall, which runs from the west coast of Scotland to the east coast, and it had about 19 forts and fortlets, and that was the northwestern frontier, and it was manned for about a generation, and then for reasons nobody knows, they abandoned it and retreated again. I was inspired to start this project, I guess for a few reasons, by my love of history and my interest in Scottish history. But also I'd been living in Tokyo for a decade, and I was moving back to Scotland, and this was one of the first projects I did when I moved back. And for me, I wanted to be out reconnecting with the Scottish landscape. I'd always been interested in the Antonine Wall. I'd first been there as a kid when I was maybe 10 or 11 with an uncle, and I decided it would be a good project to do because I could reconnect with the landscape, reconnect with the weather, but by walking on the wall from west to east, I could also have a look at how Scotland had changed and see a little bit of modern Scotland, and of course learn more about the wall and its history. When I started the project, I was basically just doing the wall and the landscape, but through my researches, I suddenly found out about a group called the Antonine Guard, who are these gentlemen dressed as Romans in my photos. So I contacted them and explained what I was doing, and they said, yeah, come and take some pictures, you can come and meet us. And I went out one very blustery Sunday morning, which was in incredibly poor weather, which is when I shot these portraits behind me. The Antonine Wall, as I said, it's not quite like Hadrian's Wall, which was a big stone-built wall, which is very easy to see on the landscape. It was a ditch and a turf rampart. And in parts it's very easy to see it, like here at Roughcastle, you can really see the outline of the fort, the defensive structures, the mounds. They have these pits called liliae, I think, or lilia, which had spikes in them and kind of garbage and leaves, so that if anybody was attacking the fort, they would fall in, they would get injured. So in some places you can still really see it, and it's very obvious. And then in other places you have modern towns built on top of it, and it's completely obliterated. This picture is actually one of my favourites from the shop, from the project. And obviously it shows a mattress in the snow, but it's on Castle Hill, which is a big hill near Bearsden on the north side of Glasgow. And upon this hill, back in the time of the wall, was a Roman fort. And it was taken in March 2013, I think. And I had woken up one Friday morning and it was snowing, and I really knew this was probably the last chance of that winter to get out and photograph the wall in the snow. And I drove up there and I hiked away up onto the hill, and there was this mattress, which fitted perfectly for what I wanted to try and do. So because I'd lived in Japan for 10 years, as I mentioned earlier, when I walked on the wall, I felt I could perhaps imagine what it must have been like for a Roman soldier to also be living abroad, away from his family, away from his culture and country. So walking there in the snow that day, you could try and imagine what it must be like for somebody from the Middle East, from Rome or from North Africa, what it must have been like for them to be stationed outside Bearsden, Glasgow, in the snow. And I thought the idea of having the mattress in the snow, which I just found, somebody had placed there, tied in nicely with showing that this was a kind of settlement of sorts, you know, a fort at least, on the hill. And for me, that's why it's one of my favourite pictures.
This project is called Drawn to the Land, Women Working the Scottish Landscape. And the reason for that is when I started the project, and met the female farmers that I was going to be photographing, I realized that they had many things in common, but one of the things they all talked about was having something in their blood that made them do what they did. So there was a real calling for them, and there was a real emotional and physical draw and connection to the landscape that they were working. I was really inspired to begin this project because after photographing and working overseas for the last 8 to 10 years, I started to look at projects and issues closer to my home and my heart, I suppose, in Scotland. And to explore my connection with my landscape was something that I was really interested in. I'm interested in telling other people's stories, and for me, you know, the landscape in Scotland is something which carries a lot of national identity for people when we leave the country. It's often what we think about. And I wanted to look at this landscape, but in a way that was more than just a picture postcard of a beautiful country, and really to scratch the surface, to look underneath, to find out and meet the people who work the landscape, form it, farm it, and make it look and appear the way it does. So that inspired me to go out and look for individuals who work on the landscape. And obviously, I was drawn to the women who are the decision makers and who are involved in that process. So I really wanted to look at the relationship between those who work the landscape and the land through their eyes, through the eyes of people who live it, who work with it every day, and who make their livelihoods from it. Working and living in a male-dominated world, as many of these women do, I was really fascinated to look at the role that women have. It's often seen as a supporting role, but really these women in these pictures are the decision makers, the owners, the long-standing tenants of their farms that have been in their families for generations. And I was fascinated by this relationship. And a female relationship with the landscape was discussed slightly as being more nurturing perhaps than a male one, and I was interested in that nuance and that difference. So this photograph is of one of the very first female farmers that I met for this project. She's called Sybil McPherson, and she owns and farms a hill farm near Dalmally in Argyllshire. Sybil's family have owned and run this farm for over 175 years. It's an incredible amount of stories she has. She talks about her connection to the landscape, and it's a very real one. And being up on the hill with Sybil and looking over the farm and just talking about the difficulties, the realities, the challenges she faces, she also talks about her real love and passion for the place. So she talked about her great-grandfather who was born on the farm. There's ruins in places of the farm where he went to school. And I've got a quote from Sybil here. She says, "This isn't hill farming, this is mountain farming. I enjoy the challenge. There's something new to learn every day. You're never in control of this. We say we farm it, but really it's only when it lets us. We are at the mercy of the elements. Ours is a fragile existence, and we have to adapt to fit where we can." So she really is somebody who takes what's thrown at her and loves it and relishes in it and works very hard. She also is representing women in many ways because she's the voice of the National Sheep Association in Scotland, and that's a role that's never been held by a woman before. So there are many aspects to Sybil which are quite interesting for this project. She says the aspect of farming that she's involved with needs to be represented, and if there's an opportunity to represent women, then she feels that's her responsibility. So again, this overriding sense of responsibility and custodianship over the land is something which Sybil really, really is a great example of.
One of the most difficult things about a project is coming up with a title. It's also one of the most fun things, because sometimes they just kind of pop out and you kind of go perfect. So the name of this American Always Scottish Forever actually appears on a t-shirt that you can buy at Scottish events in California. So some smart person has come up with this and put it on a t-shirt, and that obviously appeals to the clientele that comes to these events because they feel very patriotic about being Scottish. But even, you know, they are American, they're American citizens, so they also have to have the American Always. And they sell loads of these t-shirts, and I just thought that's perfect. It explains both sides of these people, you know, both sides of their personalities. The inspiration for this project came from me being quite far away from home for probably the first time in my life, spending a lot of time 8,000 miles away and actually feeling a little bit homesick. But looking through some newspapers, seeing some events for Scottish diaspora and people with a Scottish heritage, I thought I must go along and say hello. And going along as a photographer with your camera, the first thing that strikes you is that all these people just look amazing, and you just have to take a picture of them. So day one, took 3 or 4 nice pictures and thought, I want to continue with this. So as with a lot of photography projects, one thing just leads to another. You find something that just tickles you a little bit, and then it leads on, and on next minute you know, or 18 months later, you've got a project finished. The people in these photographs are very, very American, and I've kind of, even though some of them look like Scottish people, and some of them do have Scottish blood in them, they are first and foremost American. So when you speak to them, I have to kind of modulate my accent a little bit, and I have to talk to them about American things. But deep down for them, they are Scottish. I know it's quite hard to kind of get your head around sometimes. And some of them, I mean, there's a few people there. These Hispanic ladies are obviously not Scottish, but they learn Scottish country dancing, and they take great pride in the Scottish cultural aspect of it. So there's a real kind of mix of identity-related things going on here. The events themselves that I was photographing are actually quite similar to what you would see in parts of Scotland over the summer at Highland Games. So there's the same throwing events and tossing the caber, country dancing. So the cultural aspect of it is actually very similar, but the interesting thing for me is it's in California with palm trees and beautiful sunlight and people who are looking very tanned and healthy and who rarely see the rain. So it's Scottish but not Scottish, and I know that sounds like a little bit of a kind of cheat, but it's you can go there and actually feel very close to home. I can anyway. The people who come along to this event typically are regulars, and they actually know more about traditional Scottish culture than I do. So they'll talk to me and explain what kilts they're wearing and what the records are and the tossing the caber and who's done well at the piping competition. These are things I know nothing about typically. So these people know Scottish traditional culture more than I do, but the notion of Scottish traditional culture is actually something that was invented in the Victorian era. So it's not something that's necessarily indigenous to all of Scotland. And in many respects, if you go to Glasgow or Edinburgh, we've never been to Highland Games. These are some things that happen up in the glens and the hills, and people go around wearing kilts. I've never worn a kilt in my life. So in many respects, I'm the outsider at these events, and these are the insiders, and they're telling me about an aspect of Scottish culture I know very little about. This is the first full portrait-based project I've done, and traditionally I work in a much more kind of spontaneous and impromptu manner, and usually in cities, big cities, and I really enjoy the hustle and bustle of what goes on in pavements and streets and markets and things like that. But there was no way of doing those kind of pictures in this setting, and I thought it would be good to challenge myself to see if I could do something that's more portrait-related. But the good thing about this was actually being able to improvise along the way. So I wasn't kind of taking people out of the context of where they are. I was finding a little spot very close to where they were, setting up, and then waiting for something nice and interesting to happen. It wasn't stiff and formal and kind of, I was just literally talking to them, then bang, 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 and looking for the best picture out of the bunch. So there's a bit of a linkage. It's still spontaneous. It's still me trying to work with the moment and work with people, but in a much more kind of permissive and consensual way.
What inspired me to start this project really was the upcoming referendum on Scottish independence. And while this is a non-political body of work, what I wanted to do was make photographs which I think explored a lot of the ideas and themes around the referendum, because it talks about identity, it talks about the subtle differences between England and Scotland. And I think by walking the border, for me, it gave me a chance to really kind of explore what I think of the subject, although I'm fairly settled on my view of it in a political sense, but also just to have a look at where those kind of territories start and finish, and explore from the Scottish perspective where our country starts and finishes. If you have a look at the the map of Scotland. It's a kind of very distinctive shape, and it's a shape that we're all very familiar with in Scotland. And the border, in a way, is a manifestation of that shape. It's the start and end of the country. So I gave myself a year, and I didn't really set out with the idea that I'm going to cover every blade of grass and I'm going to stick faithfully to the actual line of the frontier. But what I wanted to do was just explore kind of funny little nuances, metaphors around the whole thing. Well, the reason I stayed on the Scottish side really was because I wanted to explore the meaning, for me, of being Scottish. I mean, there's very little difference physically between the English side and the Scottish side. I mean, if you take some of the pictures, they're on open moorland and hillsides and trees and woods and roads. There's no way the outside world could say with any degree of certainty, this is Scotland or this is England. But I think if you come from Scotland, you recognise the sort of signs of the country, you recognise the symbols, you recognise the accents. And I was quite interested in finding out where those broke down, where you couldn't really tell which was one and which was the other. But what I did discover was that that was a very difficult thing to do, that there is a difference, that even when you're walking along a stretch of moorland and there's a fence, and you know that one side is Scotland and the other side is England, you will encounter somebody or something that reminds you of the fact that the border is there. Working on the border, I mean, the way that's kind of affected me is it makes me think of the idea of home, because I don't live in Scotland, I live in England. And my home is very much where my family is, and where I live and work every day. But there's still this, if you live outside your native country, there is always this feeling that when you step back into it, whether it's you come by train or you walk over the border, you drive or you land in an aircraft, you always have that feeling, oh, I'm home. And so you have this kind of almost split personality between your kind of physical, everyday home and the kind of home that exists somewhere in your soul that you really can't define what it is. So I think it hasn't changed. Working on the project didn't really change my sort of view of who I am and my Scottishness, but it kind of gave me an excuse to explore a lot of the themes around the subject that's going on, the wider political subjects that are going on at the moment in Scotland. It's interesting, I do think about it when I cross the border, so there is a sort of change of feeling. I don't sort of, if I'm driving across the border on the M74, I don't sort of toot the horn, car horn, and sort of give out a big cheer, but I always notice it. I can always define myself as being in Scotland or out with Scotland. And I suppose because I define myself as being Scottish primarily, I know when I'm not there. So crossing the border always has a kind of, there is a sort of emotion there, not a sort of overtly a nationalistic feeling or patriotic feeling, but there is that feeling that you're back to where you started, if you like, because I don't live in Scotland anymore. So you cross the border and you do have that sense of being back where it all started, back where you grew up, back where you kind of were formed as a person. I mean, I left when I was in my late 30s, so there's no denying my Scottishness, even if I tried. These three images here are all made in Gretna and Gretna Green. And that was the historic site where people from England would run away to get married, because you could get married at the age of 16 in Scotland, but you had to be 18 in England. So traditionally people would run away to Gretna Green to get married. And for me there's still that great symbolism. If you think about the impending referendum, a lot of the talk around that is about the divorce between Scotland and England. It's a kind of overblown phrase, but these three images kind of sit quite well together. The couple in the left-hand image, I met them by chance, and they'd actually been married the previous year in Gretna, and they were celebrating their anniversary. And what I quite liked about them was, as well as his British T-shirt, she was Scottish, he was English, so there's also symbolism immediately there. The second image, again, is made in the town of Gretna, and the idea of Union Road, or the Union, that refers to the Union of the Parliaments in 1707, the Treaty of Union, which formed the United Kingdom out of Scotland and England. And that's commemorated in several towns and cities across principally Scotland. So you'll have Union Streets and Union Roads in most towns and cities. And then the third image here, this is a wedding that was taking place at Gretna Green, and it's the kind of contemporary manifestation of the idea of that marriage and potentially that divorce. So that's how those three images came to be. This picture here is, I think it's my favourite picture of the whole set, and what it depicts is basically the border between Scotland and England. And I mean, if you want to define a fine line in photographs, I think this probably defines it. You can't tell by looking which side is Scotland, which side is England, but I know which it is. It's taken on the slopes of the Cheviot, which is a major hill in, well, it's in Northumbria, it's actually in England. But you can walk all the way up almost to the summit of the hill, and as I did there one very, very cold January day. And the line, the border fence, it just takes you through some of the most magnificent countryside, and the feeling of isolation, the feeling of kind of wilderness is sort of in marked contrast to other parts of the border where you've got motorway traffic and you've got, you know, the border cuts through towns and stuff like that. So I really love that, the sort of quiet, the solitude, and it made me think about the border. And I mean, the border between Scotland and England has existed for several centuries, 8 centuries, something like that. It has survived the Union of the Crowns, the Treaty of Union in 1707. I think, irrespective of the result of the referendum on the 18th of September this year, I think there will always be a border between Scotland and England. And hopefully I'll get another chance to explore it a little more in the future.